You're sitting in a circle around a dying fire, and someone in your group just stole food from someone else. There's no police officer walking over. There's no judge, no courtroom, no written law to point to. And yet, somehow, this problem is about to get solved. Fast forward to today, and you assume conflict needs a legal system to be managed at all. Courts, contracts, police, prisons. But humans lived for roughly 300,000 years before any of that existed. So here's the real question tonight. How did ancient humans stop each other from killing one another before there were any laws? This isn't a story about primitive chaos. It's a story about something more surprising: order without authority. For most of human history, there was no king, no code, no courthouse. And yet anthropologists studying societies that lived this way for millennia found something unexpected. Conflict was common, but it wasn't unmanaged. It was handled through systems so consistent across unrelated cultures that scientists believe they're rooted in something deeper than culture itself. Understanding this means understanding why humans, alone among primates, built cooperation at a massive scale. It means understanding why fairness feels like an instinct, not just a rule someone taught you. And it means understanding that the courtroom you picture when you hear the word justice is a very recent invention. Long before it existed, something else was already doing its job. Let's start with the people who study this directly. Section 1. What anthropologists actually? Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying small-scale societies, including extensive work compiled in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, published in 1999. Boehm, at the University of Southern California, analyzed conflict resolution across dozens of hunter-gatherer groups worldwide. What he found challenged a very old assumption. Many people picture prehistoric life as dominated by the biggest, strongest individual simply taking control. But Boehm's research showed something closer to the opposite. Most foraging societies actively prevented any one person from gaining too much power. He called this a reverse dominance hierarchy. Instead of one leader controlling the group collectively controlled anyone who tried to become a leader. If someone got too aggressive, too controlling, or too self-serving, the rest of the group had tools to stop them. Not laws written on paper. Social tools: gossip, ridicule, avoidance, and in extreme cases, exile. Boehm documented that even mild bullying behavior was often met with immediate collective pushback. Someone starts acting entitled, and within hours, the entire camp knows about it. Nobody needed a written statute to know that overreach had consequences. Section 2. The first courtroom was a conversation. So if there was no formal law, how did actual disputes get settled? Anthropologist Marjorie Shostak documented this directly during her fieldwork with the Juhoansi people of the Kalahari Desert, published in her 1981 book Nisa. Disputes, she found, were rarely handled by a single authority figure. Instead, they played out publicly, often loudly, in front of the entire camp. Two people arguing over, say, who a piece of meat belonged to would air the disagreement out loud. Other members of the group would weigh in, sometimes for hours. This wasn't chaos. It was a form of communal deliberation, functioning almost like an impromptu jury. Anthropologist Richard Lee, who conducted extensive fieldwork with the same population starting in the 1960s, described disputes as intensely verbal but rarely physically violent. Shouting, yes, public shaming, often, but actual bloodshed was the exception, not the rule. Why? Because everyone in a small band depended on everyone else to survive. You couldn't just walk away from the person you were fighting with. You'd likely need their help hunting, sharing food, or defending against a predator within days. This built-in interdependence created enormous pressure toward resolution rather than escalation. Contrast that with modern anonymous conflict, an argument with a stranger online, a road rage incident with someone you'll never see again. In small ancestral groups, nearly every conflict was with someone you'd have to cooperate with again tomorrow. That changes the entire incentive structure. Section 3. When talking wasn't enough. Of course, not every dispute resolved itself through conversation. Some conflicts were serious: theft, adultery, even killings. For these, many societies developed structured, ritualized ways to settle scores without spiraling into open warfare. Among the Inuit, anthropologists documented a practice known as the song duel. Two men with a grievance against each other would compose insulting, mocking songs about one another and perform them publicly. The community would judge, often through laughter and reaction, who had won. Whoever's song landed best socially was considered vindicated. Anthropologist Jean Briggs, who lived among Inuit communities and published extensively starting in the late 1960s, described these duels as a way of channeling intense anger into a controlled, non-lethal outlet. Instead of a knife, an insult. Instead of a court judgment, public laughter. The underlying function was identical to modern law. Give people a structured, agreed-upon way to settle a grievance and move on. Other cultures developed different but parallel systems. Among some Australian Aboriginal groups, anthropologists documented formalized combat rituals, such as ceremonial spear-throwing duels, where an offender would allow a wrong party a limited, controlled chance at retaliation. The key word is controlled. A set number of throws. A set distance. Elders present to ensure it didn't escalate beyond the agreed terms. Once completed, the conflict was considered formally over. Not forgiven emotionally necessarily, but socially closed. Think about that structure for a second. That's strikingly similar to how a modern court imposes a sentence and then declares a case resolved, even if the underlying resentment doesn't fully disappear. Section 4. The role of the third party. One pattern shows up again and again across unrelated ancient societies: the mediator. Not a judge with legal authority, but a respected community member without a personal stake in the outcome. Anthropologist Bruce Knauft at Emory University studied conflict resolution among the Gabusi of Papua New Guinea starting in the 1980s. He documented how respected elders or unrelated community members would step in during disputes, not to punish, but to negotiate. Their goal wasn't to declare a winner. It was to restore workable relationships within the group. This is a crucial distinction from most modern legal systems. Contemporary law is largely retributive. Figure out who broke the rule, then assign punishment. Many ancient conflict systems were restorative instead. Figure out how to repair the relationship and prevent future harm. Restorative approaches often involved compensation rather than punishment. If someone's property was damaged or an insult caused real harm, the resolution might involve gifts, labor, or goods transferred to the wronged party. Legal anthropologist E. Adamson Hobel documented similar patterns among the Comanche and other indigenous groups in his influential 1954 study, The Law of Primitive Man. Hobel found that even in societies without written law, there were consistent, predictable rules everyone understood and expected to be followed. He argued this proved something important. Law doesn't require writing. It requires shared expectation and enforcement, even if that enforcement is entirely social rather than institutional. Section 5. What happened when resolution failed? Not every conflict ended peacefully, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Archaeological evidence shows that lethal violence, including organized group conflict, did occur in prehistoric societies. The Nataruk site in Kenya, excavated by a team led by archaeologist Marta Mirazan Lar, and published in Nature in 2016, revealed the remains of at least 27 individuals who died violently roughly 10,000 years ago. Some showed evidence of blunt force trauma and projectile wounds consistent with an intergroup attack. This tells you something important. Informal conflict resolution systems weren't perfect, and they didn't always work. When trust broke down completely, especially between different groups rather than within one, things could escalate dramatically. But here's the key nuance many popular accounts miss. Most documented violence in small-scale societies happened between groups, not within them. Within a single band, the pressure toward resolution was intense, because survival was mutual. Between two separate competing bands, that mutual dependency didn't exist, and the restraint that came with it often didn't either. This distinction matters enormously. It suggests ancient humans weren't simply peaceful or simply violent. They were intensely responsive to social context, cooperative within trusted circles, and far more cautious, sometimes lethally so, outside them. Section 6. Blood feuds and the problem of escalation. In some ancient and traditional societies, killings weren't fully resolved through mediation, but instead through a structured cycle of retaliation known as a blood feud. If a member of one family or clan was killed, The victim's relatives were expected to retaliate against the offender's family. This might sound like pure chaos, but historically it followed surprisingly rigid, unwritten rules. Anthropologist Christopher Bohm, in later research on Montenegrin highland communities, documented how blood feuds operated according to clearly understood limits. Certain targets were off limits. Certain forms of retaliation were considered proportional, others were not. Elders often negotiated pauses, sometimes permanent peace agreements, called in some traditions a bisa, a formal binding truce. This shows something crucial about how ancient conflict systems worked, even at their most brutal. They weren't lawless. They were governed by deeply internalized, unwritten codes that everyone in the community understood and crucially expected others to follow. The absence of a written legal code did not mean the absence of law. It meant the law lived in memory, custom, and reputation instead of ink and paper. Section 7. Why cooperation was the bigger story. Here's the part that often gets lost in stories about ancient violence. For a species without law books, humans were extraordinarily good at large-scale cooperation. Evolutionary anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy has argued extensively, particularly in her 2009 book Mothers and Others, that human children were raised cooperatively with multiple caregivers beyond just biological parents. This cooperative child-rearing, she argues, built deep social trust into human psychology from infancy onward. You weren't just raised to survive. You were raised inside a dense web of mutual obligation, and that web is exactly what made informal conflict resolution possible in the first place. If you grow up trusting that your community will help feed you, protect you, and include you, you have enormous incentive to preserve that community rather than shatter it over a single dispute. Evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers formalized part of this idea in his influential 1971 paper on reciprocal altruism. Trivers proposed that cooperative behavior between unrelated individuals could evolve if there was a reasonable expectation of future interaction and mutual benefit. Small ancestral bands were essentially a living laboratory for this theory. Everyone interacted with everyone, repeatedly for years, often for life. Cheating, stealing, or escalating conflict recklessly carried a real cost, your reputation. And reputation, in a small society where everyone knows everyone, functions almost like a currency. Damage it badly enough, and you might lose access to food sharing, mating opportunities, or protection. Section 8. Gossip as an enforcement mechanism. It might sound almost comedic, but gossip appears repeatedly in anthropological literature as one of the most powerful tools for maintaining social order. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, at the University of Oxford, has argued that language itself may have evolved partly as a more efficient version of primate grooming, allowing humans to monitor social reputation across much larger groups. In his research, Dunbar suggests that roughly 60% of human conversation, even today, revolves around social topics. Who did what? Who said what? Who can be trusted? In small ancestral communities, this wasn't idle chatter. It was a real-time reputation tracking system. If you mistreated someone, that information would spread through the group within hours, sometimes faster than the offense itself. This created a powerful deterrent that required no formal enforcement at all. You didn't need a police force if the entire camp already knew, by evening, exactly what you'd done that morning. Modern parallel. Think about how quickly information and judgment spreads in a small workplace or tight-knit community today. The mechanism hasn't disappeared, it's simply been layered under formal legal systems that didn't exist for most of human history. Section 9. The rule of ritual and public accountability. Beyond gossip and mediation, many ancient societies used public rituals specifically to resolve conflict. Among some indigenous groups in North America, formalized councils brought disputing parties together in front of the wider community, with designated speakers representing each side. The presence of witnesses mattered enormously. A resolution reached privately could be denied or reinterpreted later. A resolution reached publicly, in front of the entire group, became a matter of shared, communal memory. This is strikingly similar to a core function of modern courts. Public proceedings create an agreed-upon, witnessed record of what was decided. Long before written records existed, the community itself served as the record. Elders, in many of these systems, functioned less like judges handing down verdicts and more like facilitators, guiding disputants toward a resolution the group could collectively accept. Their authority came not from formal power, but from earned trust, built over years of demonstrated fairness. Section 10. What archaeology adds to the picture? Bioarchaeological evidence offers another window into ancient conflict. Beyond written or oral tradition, skeletal analysis can reveal healed fractures, indicating violence that didn't end in death. Interestingly, researchers studying various prehistoric populations have found many healed injuries consistent with interpersonal violence, followed by long survival afterward. This detail matters. It suggests that many violent conflicts, even serious ones, didn't end in death or permanent exile. People got hurt, healed, and often continued living within the same community. That pattern is difficult to explain if we assume ancient life was constant, unrestrained chaos. It fits far better with a model where conflict happened, sometimes violently, but was ultimately absorbed and managed by a community that needed its members to keep functioning together. Section 11. The slow shift toward formal law. So when did this informal system start giving way to something resembling formal law? The answer is tied closely to the rise of larger, more complex societies. As groups grew from small bands of dozens into larger settlements of hundreds or thousands, the informal tools that worked in small camps began to break down. Gossip only works if everyone actually knows everyone. In a village of 5,000 people, that's no longer true. One of the earliest known written legal codes, the Code of Ur-Nammu, dates to around 2100 BCE in ancient Sumer, roughly the region of modern-day Iraq. Even earlier, the Code of Hammurabi, dated to around 1754 BCE, laid out specific codified punishments for specific offenses. These weren't the invention of justice. They were the formalization of something humans had already been doing, informally, for hundreds of thousands of years. What changed wasn't the underlying instinct toward fairness and resolution. What changed was scale. Once a society grew too large for everyone to personally know and monitor everyone else, unwritten custom needed to be replaced with something more explicit, more standardized, and crucially, enforceable by an institution rather than a community. Section 12. The psychology that never left US. Here's something worth sitting with. Even in modern societies with courts, police, and written statutes, ancient conflict resolution instincts haven't disappeared. Studies in developmental psychology, including work by researchers such as Michael Tomasello at Duke University, have shown that very young children display a strong innate sense of fairness, often well before they're explicitly taught rules. In experiments, toddlers as young as 2 show clear reactions to unequal treatment, even when it doesn't affect them directly. This suggests something important. Fairness isn't purely a cultural invention passed down through law books. It appears to be, at least partly, a built-in feature of human psychology, shaped by millions of years in small, interdependent groups where fairness had direct survival value. Think about that next time you feel a surge of anger over something that seems unjust, even in a situation with no legal stakes at all. That reaction may be older than any legal system ever written. Caesarean 13, bringing it all together. So let's walk back through what actually happened, across hundreds of thousands of years of human history. Long before written law, small human groups relied on collective social pressure to prevent any one person from gaining too much power. Disputes were often resolved through open, public deliberation, sometimes taking hours, involving the entire community. When simple conversation wasn't enough, many societies developed structured, ritualized outlets, song duels, ceremonial combat, formal councils that channeled conflict into controlled, non-lethal forms. Respected mediators, without formal authority but with earned trust, helped guide disputing parties toward resolutions the whole group could accept. Reputation and gossip functioned as an early warning and enforcement system, making formal punishment often unnecessary. And when conflict escalated to serious harm or death, many cultures developed structured systems like blood feuds, still governed by clear, unwritten rules and negotiated truces. None of this was perfect. Violence still happened, sometimes brutally, especially between groups without ongoing cooperative ties. But the overall pattern reveals something remarkable. Humans built functioning systems of justice long before anyone wrote a single law down. Section 14, Closing Perspective. It's tempting to think of law as something civilization gave to humanity, a gift bestowed by kings, empires, and eventually democracies. But the deeper story is quieter and older. Justice didn't begin with a courtroom. It began around a fire, in a circle of people who depended on each other to survive the next season. It began with a mediator stepping between two angry neighbors, not because a law told them to, but because the group's survival required it. It began with gossip, with public shame, with a song sung mockingly at a man who'd wronged his neighbor. Every written legal code humanity has ever produced is, in some sense, a formalized echo of instincts and practices already refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Next time you think about the law, picture something older than any government, older than any written language, older than agriculture itself. Picture a small group of people, none of them all-powerful, holding each other accountable, not through force, but through relationship. That's not a primitive version of justice. In many ways, it's the original one. And it's still there, quietly, underneath every modern system we've built on top of it.